Let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Tevora's Introduction to ISO 27001 and Keys to Successful Certification. Just as a heads up, there is a chat function in the GoToWebinar functionality. So if there are any questions, we'd be more than happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. The agenda for the presentation is the following. We're going to do a quick intro to Tevora and myself. We're going to then jump into the ISO 27000 framework and provide an overview, review the components, go over a typical ISO timeline, discuss what the keys to successful certification are, and then talk a little bit about how Tevora helps organizations get certified. So a little bit about Tevora. We've helped hundreds of organizations attain ISO certification. We, of course, are an ISO lead auditor firm. We have over 13 ISO lead auditors on staff. Our clients are global, so 6 of 7 continents we have contributed to ISO 27001 certification and compliance efforts. But Tevora does a lot more than just ISO. We're one of the few organizations out there that is a comprehensive security consulting services firm, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. A little bit about myself. As I mentioned, I'm the managing director that oversees our ISO practice, and I've been in information security and compliance for almost 2 decades now. So hopefully, I can share some wisdom that I've attained over the years. So just a quick overview. The original ISO standard was originally written in 1995. And the reason why I mention that is really the ISO 27001 framework is kind of the original information security framework that garnered broad recognition. So a lot of the other certifications and attestations and frameworks out there really borrowed from ISO's standard and framework. And so it's pretty amazing that to this day, it continues to be the most globally recognized certification that others have along the way, as I mentioned, have borrowed from. The structure is really a 2-part structure. There's 10 clauses and 14 control categories. We'll get into that in more detail in the upcoming slides. One of the key terms that we use in ISO 27001 certifications is known as the ISMS, or the Information Security Management System. Think of that as just a framework of policies and procedures to achieve the outcomes. One other thing I wanted to mention, the 3-year certification cycle. Many other standards and frameworks, there's an attestation every year, such as the AICPA SOC 2 framework, PCI's data security standard, and the report on compliance is an annual process, et cetera, et cetera. I trust it's a 3-year cycle. So you get fully certified year 1. Years 2 and years 3 are what are termed as surveillance audits. So think of those as just light spot checks by your external auditor to determine whether or not you're upholding the framework. But they're not full audits, and typically your certification will last 3 years as long as you pass the light surveillance audits. Next, it's important to note that there is an annual requirement for ISO 27001, not only to be compliant with the framework, but also to conduct a risk assessment and an internal audit. We'll jump into that a little bit more in future slides. And I already mentioned the recognition that ISO 27001 has. So there's just a kind of a quick overview, some terms and some structure. We'll get into more detail here now. So these are the clauses. Those first 4 clauses: scope, normative references, terms and definitions, and context of the organization. Those are kind of setting up your ISO, your ISMS, or again, the ISMS is the Information Security Management System. Your policy set, your procedure set. This is kind of just gives organization to your ISMS. So these 10 boxes are the 10 clauses that your policy set or that your ISMS would contain. Let's get into a little bit more detail about what each of those 10 boxes are on this next slide. So as I mentioned, the first 3 clauses are kind of just definition, scope, etc. Clause 4 is the context of the organization, internal and external issue, scope, interested parties, etc. Clause 5, leadership. How is information security communicated, promoted, established? What are the resources dedicated? Clause 6, planning, risk assessment, risk treatment, objectives, and plans. I think that's pretty straightforward. Clause 7, support, resource support, confidence of those resources, training and awareness for the employees and the resources, communication and document control. Clause 8, operations, risk assessment and risk treatment. Clause 9, performance evaluation, and it's speaking to the performance of your information security management system there, not to be confused with the human resources term performance evaluation. Clause 10, improvement, nonconformities, and corrective action. So as you're identifying potential weaknesses or gaps in your environment, clause 10 is about improvement. I think, when you go back, and this idea of clauses can be a little bit abstract if you're new to ISO 27001. But just think of these as a way to organize your information security policies and how to govern your environment to emphasize information security. The Annex A is the portion of the ISO 27001 standard. It's probably what many of you may be more used to. It's really 14 control categories and spells out very specific controls that should be complied with to meet the objectives of those clauses that we mentioned. So really, think of the Annex A as the second part of the standard. Think of the clauses as the first part. It's really a 2-part structure, the clauses and the Annex A. Here are the categories, and they look pretty familiar to you if you're familiar with information security, policies, organization of your information security, human resources security, asset management, access control, cryptography, physical and environmental security, operation security, communication security, system acquisition, development, and maintenance, supplier relationships, incident management, business continuity, and compliance with internal requirements. So now we're starting to get into some information security control categories. It is worth mentioning that there's an ISO 27002 standard that is more often than not used to support these 27001 control categories. Think of these, the Annex A of 27001 is a higher level description of the requirements to maintain information security in your environment. Think of ISO 27002 as just a more detailed standard to support each of these areas, so more prescriptive controls. That's the best way I know how to frame it. So those are the Annex A categories. Remember, that's the second part of the ISO 27001 standard. The first part are those clauses. So that's the structure of the standard. Let's get into a little bit of the timeline here. And again, if you have any questions, be sure to use that chat function. The ISO timeline. So we'll typically start off with Tevora is what we call a preparation firm. There's really 2 types of firms, those firms that prepare and those external bodies that certify. Tevora is a preparation firm, but we work closely with all of the external certifying bodies and have very strong relationships with many of them over the years that we've been able to foster. So this first part, all the way from the gap analysis to the preparation, Tevora is typically engaged in those first several phases, including the remediation. And this last phase, the ISO certification, that's when your external auditor will come in and perform the actual certification audit. The external auditor and the preparing firm cannot be the same legal entity. That's why organizations typically or one or the other. If there is an organization out there branded similarly or with the same name, they're actually different legal entities. But there have been some organizations that have pursued that. Not many, because there aren't too many external certifying bodies. Tevora really specialized in preparing firms for that external certification, but we cannot, under the same legal name, be an external certifying body. So we have chose with the preparation route because it more aligns with our ideals and our focus on client relationships. So I'm going to just walk through each of the key steps and the milestones here. Feel free, again, to ask questions along the way in that chat box. At first, we'll collect existing documentation and perform a gap assessment. The gap assessment covers those clauses that we mentioned. So information security processes that support the objectives of those 10 clauses. And then also the Annex A controls, again, supported by the ISO 27002 standard, more prescriptive controls. Those control objectives, we assess your organization's compliance with each of those parts of the ISO 27001 standard. After we've conducted interviews, reviewed the documentation, it typically takes about a month, some quicker, some slower, but the median is probably somewhere around a month. We provide a gap report that highlights where your gaps are in terms of compliance with the ISO 27001 framework and recommendations on what should be done to become compliant so that your organization can become certified. So that's really kind of the first month. It's really, where's your organization at? What needs to be done to become certified? Then we really get into the remediation or the control treatment, and that can typically take as long as 3 to 4 months. Sometimes, again, it takes longer. Every organization is different, but I would say on average, if you have somewhat of a mature information security and compliance group, 3 months. If you're a small organization, 3 months. If you're a large organization that doesn't have a very mature information security management system, then it may take as long as a year. It really varies, but for purposes of this presentation, we're going to use the median time frame of 3 months. In this time frame, we do things like provide sample policies and procedures, help organizations implement controls, tools. Maybe their logging and monitoring is not quite adequate. We advise our clients on how to make it more adequate so that it complies with the standard, or maybe some of the HR processes need to be tweaked. We provide all types of guidance during that remediation period, and Tevora provides it on a time and material basis. So there's no fixed fee associated with that. It's just kind of, you know, we'll support you wherever you need supported. That's how we build our relationships, and you know, our clients have really gravitated to that over the years. So that's kind of the remediation phase, the second phase. Let's jump into the third phase. It's a really critical phase, the ISO preparation phase. So we ensure that the policy and the control framework has been established. There's a critical document known as the Statement of Applicability, otherwise known as the SOA. Really, that's a formal document that's required for certification that is a statement of the controls that you have in place to support the ISO 27001 standard. So that's a critical document we work on during the remediation phase, and that we finalize in this ISO preparation phase. And then there are these two critical milestones, the risk assessment and the internal audit. Those are formal activities that must occur to ensure that certification is obtained. The risk assessment, if you already have a risk assessment function in-house and it meets the ISO 27001 standard, then it only needs to occur once annually. So you may not have to create the risk assessment or re-perform the risk assessment. If you aren't performing an annual risk assessment, then this is certainly an activity that you would need to perform. I'd say probably 90% of our first-time ISO clients need to perform a risk assessment. So it's rare that organizations that come to us seeking certification already have an adequate risk assessment. That is something that Tevora can help out with, actually perform for some of our clients. There are many ways to go about performing the risk assessment. The second key milestone I wanted to address here is the internal audit. That is an actual detailed audit of the organization's compliance with the clauses, with the ISO 27001 clauses and the Annex A control objectives. That process takes about a month typically. If you've been around IT audits, that's exactly what it is. It's a traditional IT audit of the organization against the ISO 27001 standard. That needs to be performed by a certified lead auditor, so you cannot take that in-house. Most organizations use a firm like Tevora to perform the first one, and most of our clients bring us in. Probably 80% of our clients have us perform an annual internal audit for them, so they're getting not only an accurate, objective internal audit report, but also one that is aligned with the evolving nature of the framework. So that's the internal audit. The critical documents that need to be presented by the time you get to the stage 1 audit are the internal audit report, the risk assessment and risk register, the statement of applicability, the ISMS, and the supporting policies. That's all of those artifacts and documents that I just listed off. Those are the critical documents that need to be presented to your external auditor at stage 1 of the external audit. So that, again, that's what this last phase is depicting, is your external audit. So again, you're going to have Tevora help you out with these first 3 phases, and then you'll bring in an external auditing body to perform the external audit. Again, the external auditing body cannot be the same legal entity as the preparing firm. So Tevora cannot do both, and the external auditing body cannot do both. It's one or the other. So 99% of firms work with, organizations work with 2 separate firms to achieve certification. Stage 1, again, it's a kick the tires. Do you have those critical artifacts and documents in place? Are you aware of the standard? It's really just a quick spot check to make sure that you're ready for the real external audit, which is stage 2. So stage 1 is a quick 2 to 3 days on-site visit pre-pandemic. Now everything is remote, of course. But pre-pandemic, the external auditing body would come on for 2 or 3 days, look through that documentation, ask questions, kind of kick the tires, make sure that you're ready for the stage 2. Stage 2 typically occurs 1 to 2 months after the stage 1. So it's always a 2-step process, a stage 1 and the stage 2 for the external audit. The stage 2 external audit is really similar to the internal audit, but there's less detail in terms of documentation and evidence, and most of the external auditing firms will take a walkthrough approach more so than an audit approach. So it's a combination of audits and walkthroughs. They're really trying to put an experienced eye on your environment to see if there's any weaknesses or major nonconformities or minor nonconformities in your environment. Major and minor nonconformities are a key concept within the ISO framework, and those are areas that require action or remediation to be compliant, fully compliant with the standard. Major and minor nonconformities are noted at both stage 1 and stage 2. You're going to want to address, for most of the external certifying bodies, you're going to want to at least have corrective actions addressed for any nonconformities that were discovered in stage 1. And then certainly stage 2, the goal is to not have major nonconformities. External certifying bodies will not certify you if the outcome of stage 2 has a major nonconformity. Should be noted that none of Tevora's clients have resulted in a stage 2 major nonconformity, or a stage 1 for that matter. But a major nonconformity is the key concept, that if you have one of those, or if one of those are presented to you from the external auditor, you will not be allowed to be certified until that's been addressed. Most firms will allow certification with minor nonconformities, although that's been evolving over the past 12 months. But for now, we'll just make the general statement: minor nonconformities are okay, and an organization can be certified with minor nonconformities. And then you're certified. Typically, most external auditing firms work pretty quickly after the stage 2 audit. If there are no major nonconformities, again, you'll receive your certification typically within a month. So after that stage 2 audit, it typically goes pretty quick. So I know I covered quite a bit there. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next slide. So again, this slide kind of just reiterates our structured ISO 27001 approach, and it's going to be commensurate with that timeline that I presented. But it kind of breaks down the types of activities that Tevora helps out with every step of the way. So the gap assessment, again, we help organizations determine their scope, identify their gaps, provide remediation recommendations, and then we can also provide an executive summary for organizations that need C-suite or upper management or leadership summary of the progress of the engagement. So those are kind of some of the key activities of the gap assessment. The remediation phase, we do things like provide policy templates, your SMS template, ISMS template, control implementation support, statement of applicability development, critical tool development, BCPDR, risk assessment, etc. Let's say your organization doesn't have a business continuity plan. Organizations will ask us to write that for them if they're in a hurry. Or other organizations may just say, give us the template. We can do the business continuity plan on our own, but we would like to have a starting point. We really customize our remediation approach to whatever our client wants. So if you want us to do a heavy-handed approach on the remediation, we can do that. If it needs to be a more light-handed approach because of budget considerations, we can do that too. We really just mold the support on the remediation to what makes sense for our clients. The internal audit and the risk assessment are kind of those next two steps I mentioned. Those are two critical timelines. I would say, again, over 90% of our clients have us perform the internal audit and the risk assessment for them because, again, we are trained experts in the ISO 27001 standard and framework. You also need to be an ISO lead auditor for the internal audit portion. Some organizations go ahead and conduct a risk assessment on their own. So, that's really just up to the organization. But I'd say the majority of them have us perform the risk assessment at a minimum year one. So those are kind of the next two critical activities after remediation has been completed. We're going to perform the internal audit, and then we're going to do the risk assessment. After the internal audit and the risk assessment are completed, that's about a month to 2 months. That's when we'll start or plan for the stage 1 external audit with your external auditor. I didn't put the stage 1 and the stage 2 on this slide because we're typically less involved at that point. Some clients want us involved in the stage 1 and 2, and we're limited in the involvement we can have. But we can sit in the room during the interview and audit process, but typically external certifying bodies will not let the preparing firm answer questions, for example. But we can provide sidebar support if needed. I'd say maybe half of our clients have us provide stage 1 and stage 2 support. So again, the slide I just showed you really kind of focused on these first 3 phases. It did not depict this last phase because, again, the external certifying body will execute this last phase. That being said, we do provide probably about 50% of our clients, we provide stage 1 and stage 2 support on a time and material basis. So that's the approach. A little bit more on the internal audit and risk assessment. The internal audit needs to be performed by an ISO lead auditor. The internal audit and the risk assessment are required annually. The risk assessment framework, we get that question quite a bit. It can be, the two most prominent ones are ISO's risk assessment framework and NIST risk assessment framework. We prefer NIST because it's we recommend NIST to our clients, not prefer it, but we recommend NIST because it's more broadly recognized globally amongst the other frameworks and other regulations, whereas ISO, I think, is less adopted, although, of course, in some regions such as Europe, the ISO framework is more recognized than NIST, for example. So it kind of depends. We'll go back and forth on the framework that we use for the risk assessment, but just know if you're just learning ISO 27001, you're going to want to use one of those two frameworks for your risk assessment. The next point here, it's about 2 months prior to stage 1 audit or the surveillance audit. So you're going to want to complete your risk assessment internal audit a few months before that stage 1 audit. That gives you ample time to prepare to address any of the risks or the internal audit findings that were discovered prior to the stage 1 audit. And then you're going to want to document corrective actions and risk treatments as a result of that internal audit and risk assessment. So the internal audit and risk assessment, those are two critical milestones that the preparation firm, in this case Tevora, would typically be pretty involved in year 1. So let's talk a little bit about, so we kind of talked about the nuts and the bolts. What is ISO 27001? What does the timeline look like? Let's talk a little bit about kind of what's not as black and white. And this is kind of where I lean on my experience over the years, with what we've seen, kind of what works and what doesn't. The first is use an experienced assessor firm. It doesn't take much to become an ISO lead auditor. You really just have to sign up for a training course that costs a few $1,000, and if you pass the test, you're an ISO lead auditor. So there are a lot of boutique firms out there that say they're ISO lead auditors, but really they don't have a lot of the breadth and experience to handle, in my opinion, some of the more complex environments and even the more simple environments. It's very helpful to have an experienced assessor firm. So make sure you do your due diligence on the firm and the lead auditor firm that you're working with. It's very important. There's been a number of times where organizations have kind of started out using a boutique firm or, a 1 or 2 man shop, and then they realize they are in over their head and they end up transitioning to us, and they lose time and budget as a result of that. So start with a reputable firm if you want a streamlined, efficient approach and engagement. Use a firm that effectively supports remediation. There are a lot of preparing firms out there, some reputable, that just don't do remediation. They don't want to get their hands dirty with it. It's not as efficient for them. It may not be as profitable for them to roll up their sleeves and do things like write a business continuity plan or help you configure your logging and monitoring solution. Tevora does all of that. And the reason why we do it, even though it may be a little bit more difficult to manage, the reason why we do it is because we're trying to build relationships with our clients. Almost all of our ISO clients have stayed with us We have very little client turnover with Tevora, and when there is client turnover, it's usually an extenuating circumstance, like there was a change in CISO leadership, or the company merged with another or was acquired, that sort of thing. So our client retention is extremely strong, and I believe that one of the reasons for that is that we support remediation. Clients want a partner. They don't want just an external auditor. They want a partner to help them through certification and help them get certified. So that's Tevora's model, basically. I want to recap. Plan on 8 to 12 month timeline for certification. Don't overpromise to your leadership that, yeah, we'll get ISO certified in 4 months. It's just not realistic. If anybody is selling you that, they're selling you oceanfront property in Texas or Arizona. Texas actually has oceanfront property. So be careful with timelines. Be conservative. Use an experienced lead auditor to help you, put that timeline, a realistic timeline together. And frankly, you may not even know exactly what your timeline looks like until after that gap assessment, until you ascertain what your gaps are and could have put a plan in place to address those gaps. So you may not even know your timeline prior to the gap assessment. So think something to think about. And of course, as always with these compliance and information security certifications, get executive buy-in. You want to have top-down support. If you don't have that, it may make it more difficult to become certified. And then for all those reasons I mentioned, use Tevora. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tevora's ISO 27001 value proposition. We do things like provide policy templates. I mentioned the level of experience. We have a dedicated ISO team. So our ISO team only does ISO. So you're going to get deep-seated experience with ISO. That's not to say our firm doesn't have other experience if it's needed. Oftentimes, some of the privacy frameworks are lumped in with ISO engagements, such as CCPA or GDPR, et cetera, et cetera. We also have dedicated groups to each of those areas as well. So it's not just the depth of our ISO experience, it's the breadth of our experience in all things information security and privacy. We value relationships, like I mentioned. We're not kind of a turn and burn firm where, you know, we sign clients up, we go through it, and then if they come back, maybe they come back, maybe they don't. You know, we deeply value our relationships, and we take it personally if our clients leave us, and it doesn't happen very often. So we're a relationship-based firm. Customer satisfaction and quality, I think that speaks to the valuation of relationships. Executive oversight, engagement management. So there are some firms out there where you're typically working with junior ISO lead auditors or junior managers. As a managing director of our practice, I have oversight over all of our ISO engagements to ensure things are going as planned. And then, of course, we have a tiered structure approach. We're not just using junior assessors to save a buck or two to perform these. We have a management structure and a hierarchy to ensure the success of the engagements. I mentioned strategic remediation. Remediation is one of our strong suits. We provide executive summaries and speak to boards and the C-suite all the time. So we have that depth of experience in terms of communication. And then we're a solution provider. It's, again, not to harp on it too much, but when we point out gaps, there's no gap that we point out that we can't help you fix. So a lot of our clients like that. They don't want to kind of be left out in the cold. Okay, they called out our gap, but we don't know how to fix it. That's not Tevora's model, as I mentioned. We'll provide remediation support for any gap that is found. And that's it. That's our presentation. We like to keep it short and sweet to kind of cover the basics. If you want to know more, just feel free to reach out to Tevora. We have a number of forums on our website. You can give us a call. You can reach out to me directly. Here's my contact information. Reach out to me on LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see if we have any questions. Nope. It looks like we are good. I don't see any questions. So I wanted to thank everybody for attending. And if you're not already working with Tevora, we hope to work with you in the near future. Thank you.